Yo, Adam here, hope you're well. Today's video is going to be all about shutter speed. So according to the laws of cinema and the higher powers that be, there are these rules regarding motion blur and frame rates and shutter speeds. The whole 180-degree rule. I want to talk about this because in my entire lifetime as a wedding videographer, I've ignored most of these rules. Not all of them, but most of them. And I want you guys to be able to do that as well, because especially if you're just starting out and you're a little bit overwhelmed by all this technical jargon and this whole the settings and the cameras and the rules, the whole world of the art of filmmaking. Basically, don't worry about it. So first of all, we need to understand what shutter speed is. So your camera will have an electronic shutter that opens and closes to allow light onto the sensor, which is here. Therefore, lighting up and giving light to your image. Speed at which it does this is measured in fractions of a second. So for example, 1/25th of a second, 1/50th of a second. So if you're recording at 24 frames per second or 25 frames per second on my camera, which is the kind of cinema standard, then according to the rules, you need to have your shutter speed at double that, at 1/50th of a second. And this is going to open and close the shutter twice per frame of video that is shot. And this is the rule. This is where the rules come in. The rule is across all of Hollywood, and what everyone teaches you in film school is that the shutter speed always should be double what the frame rate is that you're shooting at. So if you're shooting at 24 frames per second, then your shutter speed needs to be 1/50th of a second. If you're shooting at 50 frames per second, then your shutter speed needs to be at 100th of a second. Your shutter speed always needs to be double your frame rate. And as long as you're doing that, as long as it's double, you should get a nice blend of motion blur to your image and it looks all cinematic and filmy. You never want to be filming less than 24 frames per second because that's too much motion blur. So if we consider that the minimum frame rate needs to be 24 frames per second, then the minimum shutter speed that you should ever be shooting at is 1/50th of a second. Any lower than this combination and you'll get too much motion blur and it just kind of looks a bit juttery and weird. And any higher and you don't get enough motion blur. So if you take your shutter speed any higher, then you're not going to get enough motion blur, which is, as I say, it's generally frowned upon in cinema world. Are you with me so far? Now for my films, when I'm shooting weddings, I always shoot at 50 frames per second because I like to have the option to slow down my footage in post-production. So if I shoot at 50 frames per second, I can slow-mo a clip by half speed so that the 50 frames per second becomes 25 frames per second and I've still got a nice smooth shot. So because I'm always shooting at 50 frames per second, the minimum I have my shutter speed is 100th of a second. Never drops, I never let it drop below that. 50 frames per second, double it, 100th of a second, never drops below that. That is the rule, that is a rule that I do adhere to. I never go below the minimum. However, beyond that, going the other way, I'm not bothered. As we said before, the shutter speed as it's opening and closing is dictating how much light's going to get onto the sensor. So on a wedding shoot with constant lighting changes and the sun going in and out and lighting that is kind of out of our control, I will use the shutter speed in order to expose my shot. And the faster my shutter speed is, the less light's going to get in, so the darker the shot goes, and the slower my shutter speed is, the brighter the image. So if I'm outside and it's a bright sunny day, I'll crank my shutter speed up to help expose my shot, and I'll go all the way up to an 8,000th of a second, which is the maximum that this camera will do. And obviously at this speed, at an 8,000th of a second, you're not getting any motion blur whatsoever, and that's totally breaking the rules. And I'm sure the Academy and Hollywood and everyone there will curse me for saying so, but I'm not making Hollywood movies, I'm making wedding films or wedding videos. 99% of the time I don't even notice the motion blur or lack of, let alone my couples. In over 150 wedding films, I've never had a client come back and mention motion blur in their video. So I just wouldn't worry about it, and I don't worry about it. If I drop my aperture, that'll obviously change the exposure as well, but I'd rather use my shutter speed than mess with my aperture because I like to keep my aperture wide open at f1.8 with this lens. so that I can get that nice kind of shallow depth of field, bokeh-y, cinematic-y kind of. Now this works for me, and I know it's not for everyone. Hopefully you found this helpful, but if you really do want to adhere to the rules of cinematography and you want to adhere to the 180 shutter speed rule, then your other option is to get an ND filter. This goes in the front of your lens, and it's like having a pair of sunglasses on your camera, and it will just help expose your footage or your shots in bright conditions. So you could use an ND filter rather than touching your shutter speed. You can keep your shutter speed how you want it, you can keep your aperture, you can keep everything how you want it, and you can use an ND filter. So I'm not saying that you shouldn't use one of these. They're good tools, there's nothing wrong with them, and there's plenty of other benefits to having them as well. I do fully intend to test one out at some point on this channel. I've been trying to research and find a good one that I can review and recommend on this channel, and I do intend to do that. But if you are a bit overwhelmed by the filmmaking side and all the equipment and the kit already, then adding an ND filter to the list of things that you need is just going to add stress and add pressure, and it's just one more thing to think about. So the hope with this video is that it makes you realize that you don't need to worry about them necessarily. They are a good tool, they're an optional tool, but you don't need them for wedding filmmaking. And if you want one less thing to worry about whilst you're filming a wedding, then using your shutter speed to expose your shot is perfectly fine in my opinion. And I just think that this is one rule of cinema that it's okay to ignore. So with that, happy shooting. I hope you found this video helpful. If you've got any questions, leave them below as ever. Hit me up in the comments if there's any other filmmaking, cinematography kind of lessons or tips that you want to know about. Subscribe if you want to see more. Loads of love as ever. I'll see you next time.